Yeah, let's just start. So basically, this started as a, when I started making this presentation, it started as just like a conversation about the equipment and the enhancements, auras, tricks in Kaldheim. But I realized that I think my philosophy on creature enhancements and the way I see them is pretty different from how a lot of people see them. I guess how they're perceived generally. And this kind of stems from, like, last week when I did my seminar on meta shifts and stuff in Kaldheim, there was a few commenters in chat that are like, hey, you're really willing to put an aura on your creature in this set, eh? I'm like, well, I think I'm really willing to put an aura on my creature in general, you know? So yeah, let's just get into that then. I've got some general stuff that I want to talk about with auras, tricks, vehicles, equipment, all that kind of stuff. And then just more, talk about Kaldheim specifics, talk about where I think each enhancement belongs, basically. So, in defense of auras, tricks, and equipment is the first place I want to start. So I think that there is this idea that tricks and auras and equipment less so. I think people generally associate equipment with good, generally. Sometimes mediocre when you're talking about commons, but less so than auras and equipment. But there's this idea that they are inherently lesser cards, a lower class of cards than other cards, right? Than card draw, removal spells, creatures. And not to say that on average they're probably not, but it's not an absolute by any means, right? And I think what happens a lot of time is people completely discount cards like the auras and combat tricks as just like last picks or things you hope to wield, things you hope to not even put in your deck sometimes, right? And I think it is very much worth recognizing the times when that's just not true, and you should be putting a one with the wind on your creature and getting in there, both in your contextual based on your deck and contextual based on the format, right? So that's what I want to get into a little bit here. And like I was saying before, the reason I want to talk about this today is this was all sparked by last week a bunch of people in chat were saying, isn't that risky? Like, isn't it risky to put a aura on your creature and attack with it? Like, for that to be your plan or part of your plan in your deck? And to that I would say yes, but it's kind of acceptable risk for the reward. In the olden days of Limited, and not even that much of the olden days of Limited, but 10 years ago, we had stuff like Doomblade running around. We had just very, very cheap removal spells. And now, not to say we don't have cheap removal spells today. We still have Demon Bolt, right? We still have good, cheap instant speed interaction. But I think what has changed is that the threats around you, or the threats that are surrounding the decks that you're putting auras in, have also changed. And so where before you put an aura on your creature, they go to Doomblade it, you're like, all right, that sucks, I just lose. I think that's just not the case anymore. And so to get into more about are enchantments risky, I think it's interesting to talk about what is risk in Magic, right? And yes, I agree that when you put an arachnid form on a creature, there is some amount of risk there, but there's also some reward, of course. I would point you to something like Tamiyo's Epiphany, though, where, in a way, if you want to frame it, and I think this is good to frame it this way, this is also a risky card in a way, right? There's risk on both sides here, but you're just placing your wager in different places, right? When you're putting a card like Tamiyo's Epiphany in your deck, you are wagering that the risk I am taking is that I will be able to survive to the late game to be able to cast this card, to be able to leverage a card draw spell. 4-mana sorcery speed card draw spell. Sorry, I should back up for a second and say, I'm sure most people looking at these cards are seeing these as very different cards, but I think they're pretty similar, actually, in the way that they, in their role in your deck. Or sorry, the way that they function in their given decks, basically, right? Because Tamiyo's Epiphany says, all right, well, if I get to the late game, if I can stabilize a board, if I can, control the board, if I don't die, this is a good card to help me win, right? So you're converting this card into a win somehow. And that's the wager you're betting, you're placing on your game and your deck. Arachniform, on the other hand, which is the extreme example, of course, the wager you're placing is that, okay, I'm going to have enough creatures in my deck enough evasive creatures, enough creatures that can get through, that this will kill them before I care about card disadvantage, before I care about, them potentially 2-for-1ing me, right? And so I would say to, anybody who's looking at these auras and saying, like, okay, I don't want to put those in my deck, that's a risk that I would be taking. I would say you're taking risks in almost every card you're playing. It's just not as obvious, I would say, as it is with a card like Arachnoform or an aura, any combat trick. Because when they remove your thing, yeah, you feel that. You don't feel the risk of something like Tamiyo's Epiphany as often, right? And now, there's definitely something to be said for Tamiyo's Epiphany doesn't have as low of a floor, but I'd say it also doesn't have as high of a ceiling, right? And so something to think about, is the key, for me at least, this was the key thing that changed my mind on auras and enchantments and augmentation, is that just because something is exploitable doesn't mean it's bad. Right, and this goes back to, there was an episode of Pro Points where Sam Black was talking about M19 with these two cards here, Rustwing Falcon and Knight's Pledge, or just the green-white auras deck in general. And he was saying that, his gut told him he shouldn't be winning games by putting Rustwing Falcon, or an aura on a Rustwing Falcon and attacking for 3 on turn 2. But it was working, and he was just winning games. And so just because, yes, there is a world where you put your Knight's Pledge on your Rustwing Falcon and your opponent kills it out from under you, and then you just can't come back from that. That isn't exploitable. There are ways to disrupt that. But that doesn't mean that in the grand scheme of the EV equation, that is a bad thing to do, right? Every card that there's risk reward, like I was saying, there's an EV equation for every card, right? How many percentage points do you gain when you put a Knight's Pledge on a Rustwing Falcon and you just, attack them and kill them? That leads you towards winning the game a lot of the time. How many do you lose when they kill it out from under you? Well, hard to say, right? But I think in general, Magic players are super risk adverse in their gameplay. And I think calculator risks should be taken just more often in general, right? I think the average Magic player would do better to take more calculated risks. And so, basically, this is the poster child for that, right? People tend to err towards the lines that will be the least bad, right? Not towards the most good, right? And you have to weigh both of them, of course. Right? Yeah, double exposure brings up a good point, where limited resources certainly has a huge part in this, where, they come, the reason limited resources is telling you not to put an aura on your creature is because for so many years, it just wasn't good, right? But now things have changed a little bit, I would say. I would go back to the Tamiyo's Epiphany, right? Where I could say, it is exploitable. If you're putting a card draw spell in your deck, me as the aggressive deck, I'm going to exploit that by saying, oh, you're tapping out on turn 4 to cast a card draw spell. That's great. I'm exploiting you in that way. That doesn't mean Tamiyo's Epiphany is necessarily a bad card, right? So it's just the same concept in different framings, different lenses, right? You also hear the argument, don't you just lose on the spot if they 2-for-1 you? And again, I think maybe 10, 15 years ago, sure. But the power level of all of the threats around your creature that you might just be putting an aura on has gone up. So yes, they 2-for-1 you in the abstract sense, but how bad is it if they 2-for-1 you? You're 2-for-1ing yourself all the time in an aggro deck, right? You already 2-for-1 yourself by putting a creature, an aura on your creature, right? So the metric of is my aggro deck winning is not about how many cards I'm up, right? It's about how well I'm pushing damage. So if you put your aura on your creature and they kill it, well, that's not the end of the world, because you've already gotten for a big hit, right? Most likely. They've used a removal spell, and the threats that you're going to deploy after, they still have to deal with those, right? It's not just game over by any means, I would say. And I think even in-game, people, when that happens to them, they feel like the game is over, when really it's not. They probably have a lot of really good cards in their deck and cards in their hand still. Especially these days, red and white get card advantage tools, right? Tuscari Firewalker, Dwarven Hammer. These are great grinding / card advantage tools. I put Breakneck Berserker here because this is a card that, you look at this card 10 years ago, I think a Magic player 10 years ago would be like, wow, that's a crazy rate for that card. And it really is compared to, back then. You wouldn't see this rate on this card 10 years ago. The threats are just better, right? And so, just to tie this all together, everything in Magic can be seen as a cost-benefit analysis, right? Where Deliberate is, low, it's inoffensive. To put it simply, right? It is an inoffensive Magic card. But how many games did Deliberate win you in Zendikar? How many games, the better way to put it, how many games did it contribute towards a win? Right? Not that many. And yes, the floor of that card is high, but the ceiling's also is not that high, right? So you got a very small window of where the card is good. Compared to something like Kitesail, Kaldheim Kitesail, where the floor on this card, sure, it's low. You can certainly imagine scenarios where this card is not good. But you could also imagine a lot of scenarios where the card is very good. And especially because your deck is optimized to use this card, there's going to be a lot more scenarios where the card is good compared to where the card is bad. Right? I would say, if you look at the numbers, Kitesail, Cliffhaven Kitesail has won many more games in Zendikar than Deliberate has, So to tie this whole augmentation chat together, I just want to say that I think the takeaway is unlearn things in just the right amount, right? I'm not saying the new meta, the 2021 meta, is just put auras and equipment on your creatures and go to town, and that's just like the best thing to be doing. I'm just saying if you're coming from a place where you grew up on limited resources like I did, where you do have to unlearn this kind of stuff at a certain point because, things have changed. Don't look at an aura, don't look at a combat trick, whatever, and just immediately write it off or immediately downgrade it as a class of cards. Instead, think about where would this card be good? What situations is this card good? How can I optimize on this card, right? This is a theme in just all limited Magic. If you look at cards as not why is this card bad, but how can I optimize on this card, you're going to win a lot more Magic games, and you're going to, you're going to feel much more comfortable in a format if you stop looking at why is this card bad and instead, how can I make this card good, right? I remember when the moment I think I realized this was I was drafting Ixalan with Ryan Sachs on Skype. And I was drafting like a black-red deck. It was just like a pirate black-red deck. And I was at the end of the pack, and I had like Swashbuckling in my pile because it was a last pick from some other pack, and I took some like stupid card from another color over Blightkeeper, right? And Ryan's like, "Oh, I think you really want Blightkeeper there." I was like, "Why?" And he's like, "Because you have Swashbuckling." And I was like, where is the synergy in that? I don't understand. Like, why do I want those two cards in my deck together? And he's like, well, you put the Swashbuckling on the Blightkeeper and you kill them. And I was like, oh, okay, yeah. that makes a lot of sense, right? So yes, these two cards have synergy, I would say, when maybe they don't look like they do inherently. Which, maybe they do these days, because this is a pretty common play pattern in a lot of sets, right? But I want to point out also that format factors are relevant, right? Ixalan was the aura set. Generally, it was known for being like, okay, yeah, you're supposed to put a 1 with the wind on your creature and kill them, because the removal was very clunky. You wouldn't get punished very often. There was also Dive Down, which was like a Snakeskin Veil variant. There's protection spells. There's going to be some formats, and again, some decks that this is better to do than others, right? In Dominaria, this is awful to do, right? Because the auras weren't very good. The creatures were, going back to what is around this strategy, like what shell are you putting this in? The other aggressive creatures in like a red-white deck were not good. So if you put an aura on your crappy creature and they kill it, yeah, you probably do lose the game at that point because the rest of your creatures aren't going to be good, right? So things that really affected are like, how expensive is the removal? How many cheap evasive creatures do you have in your deck in the format? How many ways they're protected, right? The Snakeskin Veil Arachniform strategy in Kaldheim draft. Those type of things, basically. So I just want to get into my thoughts on each of these card types a little bit. So let's just talk about auras first. And so I want to talk about the functions of an aggressive aura. Number one is to convert cards into damage, right? Just like Tamiyo's Epiphany converts cards into other cards, or, certain cards convert cards into mana, auras essentially, at their core, convert a card into damage, which is what you want in your aggressive deck. The philosophy of fire, if anybody knows this, the old Mike Flores thing, where it basically says, if every card in your deck deals 3 damage to the opponent, it's kind of done its job, and it's in an aggressive deck, because you're going to draw, your 7 opening cards. Obviously, some of them are going to be lands, but, if you can deal 21 damage over the course of the game with 7 spells or so, you won the game, right? And so that, I put a +2/+2 on a flyer. If that gets in for 4 points, that's already done its job, right? Obviously, number 2, it enables profitable attacks. Happens sometimes. Sometimes you just put it on a flyer and it gets past another flyer. Sometimes you just put it on a 2-drop, gets past another 2-drop. But this third thing I think it's really important is it is to assemble Splinter Twin. Where Splinter Twin being, the whole thing we've been talking about this whole time, but put one on a flyer, put an aura on it. You just win the game a percentage of the time when that happens, right? And I think going back to the whole EV equation, you have to factor in the times when that happens, when either you just win the game because it just carries the whole game, it goes the full distance, or it gets them down to like 7 and then it's trivial to kill them from there. So again, weighing the two things, the cost benefit, the EV analysis, whatever you want to call it, yeah, sometimes it gets killed. That creature gets killed that you put the aura on. It's not that bad though. Going back to that again, when that happens, it's not the end of the world. And when it works, you win the game a percentage of the time, right? But wait, there's more. There's not just these purely damage-dealing buffing enchantments, right? We've also got, these days, they make auras better, right? We've got Spectral Steel, which gives you, mitigates the card disadvantage a bit. We've got stuff like Spider Umbra. You see things like this sometimes where there's some built-in protection. There's things like Faith Unbroken, where it's like, it's really tempting you to be like, all right, really high risk, really high risk, but also really high reward, right? You put a Faith Unbroken on a creature, you exile their best thing, and it's like, all right, well, yeah, I really got to deal with that thing, and it massively swings the game, right? So really, Chirium says, I haven't played with Faith Unbroken, but it looks like a recipe for disaster. Exactly, right? It looks like that, but this card won many themes of Eldritch Moon Limited. Card is very, very good. Card is one of the better white uncommons. So there's some creatures you're looking to play when you're playing auras. Obviously the 1-mana flyers. But anything with a keyword, right? This is a common theme when we're talking about augmenting creatures, where keywords play well with augmentation, whether that be equipment, auras, combat tricks, right? Because basically, if you can play lifeline creatures, play first strike creatures, the stat boost they gain from those augmentations is great, right? It's not just the stat boost, but it's the stat boost with lifelink, with first strike, right? So look for that. Even something like, Fearless Pup, just the 1-mana 1/1. I had my eye on that card from the beginning of Kaldheim, because it's like, okay, well, 1-mana 1/1, no text, has some potential, right? Obviously Fearless Pup is better than that. Moving on to some combat tricks here. So the reasons you want to play combat tricks is tricks can often function as better removal spells, right? Especially when you get some really clunky removal spells like Synchronized Spellcraft. I would take the first 2 Inordinate Rages over the first Synchronized Spellcraft in most of my red aggro decks in Zendikar draft. Same thing, obviously, I don't want to use the Run Amok example for the entire presentation here, but Run Amok is the clear, this is better than a clunky removal spell a lot of the time, right? Because instead of having to tap out for a 4-mana removal spell, well, you get to go attack all, use my combat trick and cast another thing, right? And so it functions as a removal spell, but because you're an aggressive deck, you kind of get this privilege of being able to not have to pick up the removal to interact with your opponents, because you put them in a spot where combat tricks are actually going to do the thing you want them to do, which is act as creature removal, right? Combat tricks solve the scarcity issue for aggressive decks, and this is kind of an interesting way to think about this, where so inherently aggressive decks want to take good threats over good removal, right? And the problem there, of course, is that everybody else at the table, not everybody else, but a lot of people at the table are going to want to take the removal spells very early. And of course, removal spells are a scarce resource. There's not that many of them, especially the good ones, right? So the fact that you as the aggressive deck can take those good threats early, your Clarion Spirits, your Shepherd of the Cosmos, your Raptors, whatever it is, but then not need to take this commodity that every other deck kind of needs, and instead replace it with combat tricks like Run Amok or even equipment. That's pretty powerful, right? There's a lot of power in that. Where, and this goes back to another just overarching draft concept, where if you can value something at the table that the other people aren't, like if you can get value out of a card that nobody wants, that's great. That's fantastic, and that's what happens a lot with the combat tricks. Just a small point here, small water break too. 1 mana tricks are much better than 2 mana tricks. Just the fact that you can go play a 2-drop on turn 3, play a 1 mana trick, play a 2-drop after that, after I won the combat. That's huge, right? You don't want, you would like your combat tricks to not disrupt your flow of curving out. I'm putting Thrill of the Hunt here because it's Tom Straddle Remaster just came out, and this is one of the better tricks. One of the better tricks, honestly, that they've printed ever. This card does not look that impressive, but it's very, very good. So yeah, like, when you're evaluating new sets, look for the 1 mana tricks, because those are going to be generally better. If I have a 2 mana or 3 mana trick, especially a 3 mana trick, it has to do something really special. Obviously, Run Amok is something special. That's why we play it. But 3 mana tricks are often kind of yikes, right? They have to do a lot for me to want to play it. Play a 3 mana trick. Tricks that give trample are premium because, as most of you know, if you've played with Run Amok, if you've played any Kaldheim Limited, you know what it feels like when your opponent goes, okay, Run Amok on my blocked creature. Normally with Trill combat tricks, the thing is like, okay, they use their combat trick, but I got a little bit of a life buffer because I blocked. But that just doesn't happen. That just does not happen, right? Run Amok says, yeah, your creature was basically unblocked, and I kill your creature. Wild Hunger, also a sick trample trick. So just, again, in the future, look for tricks that have trample, but also look for creatures that have trample in your aggressive decks, right? I was talking before about how when you have augmentations in your deck, you want to have creatures with keywords, because that makes your combat tricks better, right? That just gives your combat trick keyword, basically. Can you talk about Thrill of the Hunt versus Wings of the Cosmos, says Trippy Toad? Oh, sure, for sure. So Thrill of the Hunt, well, flashback on this card is pretty big, right? Just being able to do this twice, either like 1 in 1 turn, or and then like do it again in the next, or just go like white green +2/+1. That's pretty big. I would say this card's a lot better than Wings of the Cosmos, although Wings of the Cosmos is pretty good too. I'm gonna talk about Wings a little bit later, but just to compare those cards, this card's a lot better. Just got here. What is the scarcity issue again? The scarcity issue is the fact that you can't pick up all the removal spells in the world, and your aggressive decks are going to want to prioritize. Let's go back to the slide for a second. Your aggressive decks are going to want to prioritize threats over answers, and so you don't pick up all the answers that a different deck, like a controlling deck, might have. And so the nice thing is that the combat tricks can act as removal spells, right? You basically don't need removal as badly because your combat tricks can act as the removal spells. And whereas a mid-range or controlling deck can't reliably use combat tricks as a removal spell, because you're often putting your opponent in a position where they need to block, it can act as a removal spell, where the other decks can't rely on that. Moving on, tricks can be great sideboard cards. I side in tricks a lot. It's probably the largest class of cards that I side into, or out of sometimes too. But when I am a mid-rangey or controlling deck, and I'm facing an aggressive deck, I will often side in something, especially like Wings of the Cosmos or Snakeskin Veil. A toughness boosting, I guess Snakeskin Veil is not the best example, but a toughness boosting cheap combat trick, because the aggressive deck is trying to play a game where they're not playing on your axis. They're saying just like, I'm trying to, in the first 3-4 turns of the game, I'm trying to make all of my cards better than all of your cards, basically, right? Because their 2-drops are ideally going to be better than yours, and their 3s are going to be better than yours, especially because they have tricks to back them up, and you likely won't. But combat tricks. Oh, sorry. The other thing is that they can often deploy their cards a lot quicker than you. They can. You often are stuck with single spelling a turn when they can start double spelling as early as turn 3 or turn 2 sometimes, right? So what a cheap combat trick as a sideboard card does, number one, Wings of the Cosmos is just nice because it, kind of counters a burn spell or whatever. But you can go you can play their game where you go play 2-drop to block. Okay, that got tricked out. They attack, they trick, sure, but whatever. Then you play another 2-drop and they go for their attack on their creature. You kind of flip the script on them and you go, okay, Wings of the Cosmos, I ate your 3-drop for 1 mana. And then you've kind of gotten past that point where their cards are lining up more favorably than yours at that part of the game, and you can kind of bridge the gap between the early game and the late game, right? So yeah, I often find side into combat tricks I'm facing aggressive decks. Long and short of it, right? Cheap ones. Equipment. Let's talk about equipment. Yes, it's a tempo swing in that case. Exactly. You need when you're interacting with an aggressive deck, you need to play the game on their level, and the game they're playing is out-tempoing you, right? So I think, equipment, like I was saying, don't get as bad of a rap as auras and combat tricks do, because good equipment get printed more often than tricks or auras, right? You've got Lockdown Warhammer, Shadow Spear, these busted equipments, Jitte if you really want to talk about busted equipments. But even when we're talking about, when we go to the common ones, I think they got overlooked a lot of the time. All these cards are very similar for a lot of reasons. They're all swords to some. I guess this is an axe, but and this is a pick. Okay, they're not actually all swords. They're all very different weapons, but they all give a small boost. They're all cheap. They all have 1 to equip. But the thing that these cards all did in their respective formats, and Deathsea talks about this on the episode of Lords Limited he was on, where what they do is they take small creatures, and especially if the format is full of small creatures, and they kind of break parity. Where in M21, Short Sword was very good because all the creatures were small, and the more expensive creatures were even small, right? The expensive creatures were like 5 mana 4/3s and hill giants and stuff. So they take your 2/2s and let you trade up with 5 power creatures, or 5 CMC creatures. But if you're facing a deck where, an aggro versus aggro deck, it also helps there, because at every point of the curve, your creature can be a little bit bigger than their creature. Or I should say, once the game has gone to, a few turns, like turn 5 and 6, you can start to make better trades, right? Where your 2-drops trading with their 3, your 3 is trading with their 4, and et cetera, et cetera. Basically, if you have these equipment on the battlefield, the longer the game goes, the more you are favored, because your creatures are just instantly just better, right? Just inherently better because you can equip them all. Bone Splitter in original Mirrodin was like this because all those creatures were very, very small. If anybody played original Mirrodin, it's literally like 1/1s and 2/2s, and so Bone Splitter was just like this huge mirror breaker, or not even mirror, but just like format breaker, where you put your Bone Splitter on your 1/1, and it's like, okay, that's a real threat now. Goldvein Pick does the exact same thing in this format, where the creatures are pretty small, right? And just being able to, you'll find this often in a combat, where it'll be able to attack past, their 3-drop, just because by virtue of this being a +1/+1 bigger, which isn't that big of a stat boost, but it's enough, basically, right? So look for that, right? Look for, to contrast that, Short Sword was not good in Dominaria. Number one, because that's not what the format was really about. It wasn't about small interaction. It wasn't about close combat interactions, really. But also, the big creatures were big. They were very big, right? They weren't, a little bit bigger. They were actually massive. The small creatures just, even when you put the +1/+1 on it, they couldn't compete, right? So equipment can push damage or help you grind. So the question I have posed here is, which is Tormentor's Helm better on Battlefield Raptor, or is it better on Scary Firewalker, or these other small creatures like I was talking about a second ago? And it's kind of both. and this is something that I had to get used to at the beginning of this format, where it's I had associated Tormentor's Helm with ground creatures because the flying creatures aren't getting blocked, very often. And so I was like, okay, you want Tormentor's Helm in a low to the ground creature deck, right? But at the same time, the equipment also play well with the evasive creatures because they do the aura thing, Battlefield Raptor into aura. The clock isn't as quick, but it's you can move it around, you can get blown out, right? So just in general, these small equipment play well with evasion, but also with the small creatures. In Kaldheim, the not just in the aggressive decks, but in the elf decks, you can grind with these equipment. Elvenbow is a great example. Goldvein Pick's a great example, where you have these small creatures, and you're converting the small creatures into a real thing, a real card that can tussle with these equipment, and it's kind of an attrition war, right? Where you're like grinding. Again, my small creature's trading up for your slightly bigger creature each time, and you're attritioning them out. Don't forget to move your equipment. This is maybe obvious, especially if you've been playing a long time, but a lot of times I see players just forget to move their equipment after combat, where they I think mentally we lock it in almost as an aura, right? Where it's like, oh yeah, I can actually move that thing, and it's cheap, something like a Goldvein Pick. You can move it around. I'm guilty of this too, where I'm like, oh crap, I didn't move it, right? You can move it on blocks, so you have a better block, so... Yes, exactly. Great point, Two-Ply. Unless your creature only has 1 toughness left, because then you will be very sad. So let's talk about vehicles, which is the last and the newest in the enhancement line here. Vehicles are difficult to evaluate, I think just mostly because they're the newest card type, and we haven't had as much experience. Like, I think if you asked 100 players which one they thought would be better in Kaldheim Limited at the beginning of the format, Longboat or Carve, I'm pretty sure most of them would say Longboat. I would have said Longboat, right? So it's like, I think vehicles are the most contextual too, right? Where it's definitely, you can theorycraft for sure where they'll be good and like how they'll be good, but almost like, something like Dowser of Lights, the 5-mana 4/5 from Guilds of Ravnica, or any creature that is good because its stats line up well with the format. That's kind of the way I'm evaluating vehicles, where it's like, it's not so much the crew cost matters, the cost matters of course, but like, it's very much like, how often can this thing get in or do its thing. Again, crew cost matters, right? That's huge. Low crew cost, like 1 and 2 is so much better than 3. But I think that where I fall on vehicles is generally like, I will play them when they line up well with the sizing of the format, right? Moving on to other vehicles here, Renegade Freighter. Like, some of them are clearly busted, like Renegade Freighter, but some of them are less subtly busted, where like Consulate Dreadnought looked like an awful card if you played Aether Revolt, but it actually ended up being pretty good. Kind of similar to how Carve is good, where you want a lot of 3 power creatures to crew it. This thing was just like, came down on turn 1. There weren't many like 1-drop things you wanted to do in that format. It was just like uniquely large, where it just puts them into the abyss very quickly, right? So yeah, I mean, long story short here, like I was saying, I think they're tricky to evaluate. You can certainly theorycraft on them when the set comes out, but be very willing to be wrong, and to that point, be willing to experiment, right? That's what I would say about vehicles. So let's talk about Kaldheim specifics. In kicking off this conversation, I want to kind of frame this as asking your cards what they want you to do. And this is a concept that I think Sam Black is fantastic at this, like phenomenal, where it's like really asking yourself mechanically, how are my cards interacting? Because this is what the whole conversation about what equipment and what augmentations you want in your Kaldheim deck, like what decks want run amok, what decks want equipment instead, because I think it's very easily to group in, in my aggressive deck, I want combat tricks and removal and equipment, right, and auras and stuff, right? And it's much more about how do these individual cards interact within these aggressive decks. It's not just a broad aggressive decks want XYZ. It's these specific, this subset of aggro decks and cards. This subset of cards in my aggro deck would like to play well with these other cards, and you can apply that more broadly to just like not just aggro decks, but to your mid-range and your to control decks too. Really getting down to the fundamental question of what are my cards asking me to do, what are the incentives, and what plays well together, and not just looking at the broad spectrum of aggro plays well with aggro, control plays well with control, right? Nosen says this can also be a trap. A lot of cards are still bad when they're doing what they want, which is unintuitive. 100% Nosen. I think that plays into this, where it's like, that's the experimentation phase, right? Where it's like, you should definitely theorycraft about it and try things out, but then also recognize when it's just not doing the thing. 100%. So let's talk about Goldvein Pick. I'm just gonna get into specifics here, where what is a pick deck? And I think the common knowledge now that the format's been out for 2 months is that it's generally a white card, right? Sirkovitz did the 17 lands evaluation or the analysis of the data. You can go check that out on Sirkovitz's Twitter. May I ask? Oh, Sam Black. Sam Black, Harmos. Yeah, sorry. I did not enunciate that properly. Sam Black has a great podcast and a great stream. So yeah, Goldvein Pick, I correlate heavily with white cards, basically flying. You generally want this card to be making mana for you, and you generally want to have it get in consistently. I am more likely to want this card. I'm looking at this card as a ramp card, not as a fixing card, but it can be fixing sometimes. So that's your mileage may vary with how much you want to count this as a fixing card. But the number one place I'm correlating Goldvein Pick to is white aggressive cards, right? This collection of cards, right? So like the flying cards work well, but also these cards work well. Like I was saying, equipment plays well with keywords, but also works well with shield make because they trade off and you get another thing to put an equipment on, right? Also the runes, obviously, the runes are great. I'm going to talk a little bit more about those in depth in a minute, but the more I play this format, the more I realize the runes are just premium. You should be taking these cards early because as decks are less focused, because you don't get focus giants decks or focus snow decks as often. You don't get the nuts versions because people are fighting for those decks. Just having a rune package in your deck gives your deck some complexity. Gives your deck a pocket of synergy. Gives your deck something more than just the cards in front of you, right? You can be an elf deck with a Goldvein Pick rune package. You can be a giant deck. A giant... Don't clip that 2-ply. You can be a giant deck with Goldvein Pick and the rune package, right? And that's just fantastic. I've really loved basically all of them. I mean, the Naya ones are the best, but... all of them have their place. I also want to point out that, and I have 2 decks here, Jason, and this one's Jason's, and this one is Zinder's. I see Jason's in chat, I don't know if Zinder is, but where in Elves Pick is okay too, where it doesn't quite do what you want it to. It doesn't quite, get in consistently. It doesn't quite fix you. Which is 2 things that the elf deck wants. The elf deck wants ways to augment its creatures, but it also wants to fix because you're also splashing. But it does enough things just well enough, basically, right? Where it fixes you some percentage of the time, grows your small creatures some percentage of the time, helps you grind a little bit. Similar here. This one's a little bit different because this one just has white creatures, but you're doing similar things here. Well, it helps you grind, helps you fix your colors for the cards you're splashing or whatever. So yeah, those are the 3 big places I want Goldvein Pick. These mid-rangey green decks, when I have runes and when I have white cards. Which is basically everywhere, right? Everywhere in the format. I want to talk about Rune Crown, because this is just premium. I think this card is a premium uncommon. You should be taking this over a lot of rares, a lot of commons, a lot of uncommons. It's kind of funny, I was thinking about this when I made this presentation, and I actually think that Rune Crown is probably better than Runeforge Champion Pick 1 Pack 1. Obviously the colorless matters, but when you go get your rune with Runeforge Champion, you're sometimes forced to put the rune on a creature, because you don't have an equipment, right? And you would like to try your best to not put a rune on a creature. You'd like to put it on an equipment, and this gives it to you up front. So I think that Pick 1 Pack 1, I would take Rune Crown over Champion. That being said, Runeforge Champion gets passed to me way too often, basically. This card, this is the top 3 rares in this set that get passed to me way too often. Magda, Elvish Warmaster, and Runeforge Champion. I think those are my 3 top drafted rares, actually. Take this card. This is a good card. This is a great card. Obviously, it requires a little bit of setup, a little bit of draft cost, but it's very, very good. Again, the things that the runes provide to your deck to giving it some complexity, this is part of that package, right? So let's talk about each rune and kind of where I like each of them. Starting with Rune of Sustenance, where I think Rune of Sustenance is the most generically good card, in the sense that it's good in I think it's like the one rune that's very good in your controlling decks, which doesn't happen very often, right? Controlling decks just aren't that common, but good in your mid-rangey, like, Lindworm decks. I think it is a little overrated in the white decks, just because, like, it's nice to have, like, be able to race with impunity, like, not care about the crackback, but it doesn't, like, push damage or anything. It is a big problem for any other opposing aggro deck. So the equity you gain in the aggro versus aggro matchup is definitely worth something. But I feel like I generally have pretty good game, at least the way I'm building my aggro decks, with just the a lot of equipment, first strikers, lifelinkers. I already have pretty good game against the opposing aggro decks. Now, of course, that gets into like a game theory meta thing where, like, if the opposing person is building like I am, obviously Rune gives something that the deck doesn't already have. But I feel like I'm already favored in a lot of my aggro matchups, basically. So the card is good. Definitely good. You want to be pairing this with larger creatures if you can. Green-white is a great place for this. But yeah, I think that it is the third best rune overall. I do think the red and the green one are a little bit better, just because they provide power and toughness, which is really big. And it's hard to quantify this because it's matchup dependent. Obviously, these are all in the same tier. I think rune is maybe like Rune of Might's a little bit higher up, but yeah, I'm a little bit lower. Like, I know people think this is the best one. Some people think this is the best one. I'm not quite there. Rune of Flight is the one I'm the lowest on. I think because your blue decks just don't have equipment all that often, and it's nice with Rune Crown. It's nice if you can splash it, but it just doesn't provide enough. Like, usually your equipment already do the job of getting your smaller creatures in past the bigger things, and so like it does it a little bit better than just like a +2/+2 equipment, but like not so much better that I want to be taking it early, or I want to be like having it take up a spell slot in your deck, right? It is pretty good in red-blue because you have like Craven Hulks, just like big creatures, and you have Boast creatures. Like if you put this on a Firewalker, if you put this on the an Infiltrator, the 2/1 that makes 2/1s, it's pretty good there. Other than that, it's just the worst one, I would say. Rune of Mortality is the second worst one, where it has some nice combos. Combos well with like the pup, right? Any first striker, obviously with Hoggy Mob, like it's kind of a red-black card in that sense. But just like Rune, it doesn't like help you get in all that much better, right? It's good in the elf decks. Like this is a pretty good one to put on an Elven Bow because it helps you grind. But it's not like one I want to take for my Rune Crown red-white deck, for example. Right? Yeah, combos with Trample. That's a good point, Jason. And then Rune of Speed and Rune of Might, I do think are the best one because they increase power. Rune of Might giving Trampler is great. Haste is great too. I think these are the premium ones, basically. Yeah, not much to be said about that, except I guess I'm taking Rune of Might as a pretty premium card these days. Just like I will not shy away from first picking it. Oh, I guess it is worth noting that I don't like. I see this getting put in decks just as like a cantripping, make my Lindworm trample kind of card, like with no equipment. You can do that, but I don't think you want to be doing that, right? Like, this is an easy cut if I don't have equipment, basically. Like, any of these runes are pretty easy cuts if I don't have equipment. The exception being if I have ways to buy them back, like Master Skald or Shepherd of the Cosmos, right? Let's talk about this cycle now. The chunky, the good equipment, the uncommon ones, the great ones. So my ordering for this is a question that gets asked really often. What's your ordering for the power rankings of this? And I think I would say just like the runes, actually, these two are the best. The bow and the hammer. This one's in the middle, and these ones are the worst. So I think that Dwarven Hammer and Elven Bow are very, very close. I've heard good players argue for both as the best ones. Like, Elven Bow, they do different things, right? Where Dwarven Hammer just pushes damage so well, and Elven Bow kind of does the opposite, where it just helps you die. Oh, no, it doesn't help you die. That's not what you want. It helps you not die so well. Elven Bow helps you grind. Dwarven Hammer also helps you grind, but closes out the game a little bit quicker, right? So, I mean, like, I don't think it really matters ranking them. They're both up there. They both have their merits, basically. Valkyrie Sword is a card I like a lot. I've come up on this card quite a bit. I especially want to pair this card with Goldvein Pick and the Courser, Pegasus Courser. just to make it cheaper. If I can get this for 6 mana, that's fantastic. You know, I think it's actually like a fine include in my deck if I don't have either of those cards too. Just big flyer. It's very big. These two, we were talking about this last night. Funny how like Giant's Amulet has had the largest fall from grace because I think people read the card, read Hexproof, and go, ooh, Hexproof. It's a good card. It's a good defensive play, but it's nothing special. It's a 5-drop, you know. It's probably the equipment that gets moved around the least, I would say, because it's just least impactful. After like the 4/4 is the thing you hear about here. It matters though. It definitely matters. So I don't want to talk it down too much. And then Draugr's Helm, like, it plays the role of a way to help the black decks grind, but I just feel like there's better ways, right? Like, it's just clunky. 4 is a lot to equip. I think the card's fine, but I'm not prioritizing it at all, basically. All right, moving on. Where do you want to run amok? This is a question also gets asked very often. So I think at the beginning of the format, people were playing run amok in like every single red deck, red, white, red, green, red, whatever deck. Even they're like controlling red, blue giant decks. That's something that, you know, you have to be careful of. I'm sure most people watching this probably are pretty aware of this, but like, just because a card is good in one deck doesn't mean it's gonna be good in all decks. Like, don't put run amok in your, you know, in your crush the weak control deck or whatever. But it did happen, and I think people have let up on that a little bit more. But just to put a stamp on where I want the card, I think it is more of a red card than any other color. You could argue it for being a green card too, and obviously like calling it a red card is obvious, but the red cards tend to have higher toughness than the white cards. Like, it's not just generically a red-white card, right? Because you want this to play well with... This plays well with high toughness. Because what happens on something like Beskir Shieldmate is that a good player, if you attack with a Shieldmate and maybe something else, or like another small toughness creature, they'll just double block, right? And you want your creature to survive the run amok. And if this gets to 4 toughness, well, that's not going to survive very often. Now, it's not the end of the world. But when spell slots are a scarce resource, I tend to cut this card from my red-white decks when I'm heavier on white. Also, it doesn't play well with flyers. So, like, if you're an evasion-based white deck, which a lot of the white decks are, of course, with the Coursers and the Raptors, doesn't play as well there. I think it plays best with Praven Hulks. Even, like, Axgar Cavalry plays pretty nice with, just being a 2 toughness creature. The other place it goes well in is just, like, if you're going wider. Like, if you have Dwarven Reinforcements, it plays pretty well. Just because, like, you get to this point... You know, the situation I was describing before is often in the early game when you have, like, 2 creatures, right? Where they attack... You clearly have a trick. You attack, and they go, okay, well, they have a trick. I should just double block. And like you said, a good player will know to double block there, especially this late in the format. But... what you can get into is situations where your board is going wide enough where you just don't care. Like, it's okay to give up a creature because no matter where they block, they're just going to die. And that just doesn't happen all that often because it's harder to go wide in this format than I think in other formats. But if you have Dwarven Reinforcements, if you have like Clarion Spirit or whatever, if you have the other ways to augment things like... Or sorry, if you have ways to go wide, I do like run amok there still. Which is weird. It doesn't look like a go wide card, but it is. Code Spellcraft's one I see in a lot of decks that I don't love. I like this card specifically with Battlefield Raptor and Clarion Spirit. Like, plays well with flyers. Like, I want to have a density of Raptors, basically, to play this card. That's the key thing, or just like a density of flyers, I guess. It doesn't have to be Raptor, but obviously it plays nicely with Raptor. It's not just like a generically good aggressive card. Like, if I have a mono white deck or like close to mono white deck where I don't have a lot of flyers, but this just comes down as like a 1-mana 2/2 some of the time, it's okay there. But you really want to go like put the counter on something meaningful and then suit this up with an equipment, basically. You want to have it play double duty. And if it can't do that, it's not that great in your deck generally. Kai's Onslaught's another one that I think is just like seen as generically good, but you kind of want to be choosy about where you're playing it. It is good. It's an amplifier, right? It's not so much just like it's worse run amok if you don't have other tricks. But if you have these cards, like things that make your creatures very big, especially things that give trample, Or if you have evasion, that works too. The card's busted, right? So I think that the floor on this card in your deck is like worse than Run Amok if you don't have these types of cards. But if you do have these types of cards, you're definitely going to want to pick this card up. And it's fine to speculate on, of course, as well. Spectral Steel plays well with other Spectral Steels. If you have multiple Spectral Steels, you can buy back your Spectral Steel and get more Spectral Steels. Also plays well with runes, but the place I found it best is when you have many Spectral Steels. Valor of the Worthy, I found I don't really want this card very much. It's just there's better things. You can do better. There's better enhancements, basically. You could put this card in your deck if you had multiple Coals or something, but again, I think you can just do better. Right? It's like a card you put in when you somehow are in red white and don't pick up the equipment. Yeah, it just does not do. It does not pressure well enough. It does not give you enough of a benefit, right? Just like a 1-mana 1/1 is not a great threat, a +1/+1 aura is not a great threat. In converse to how I was talking up the +2/+2 auras, basically. Warhorn Blast versus King Harold's Revenge is an interesting one because this is a card. These cards are, I think people get these cards reversed a little bit, where in their decks that are going a little bit wide, they want to play Warhorn Blast as opposed to wanting to play King Harold's Revenge. I think King Harold's Revenge is just a much better card, both because it takes less to kill them generally. You don't need to have like a super wide board. You can have just like a medium wide board, and this kills them. It pairs well with the double strike trick, any other tricks too. Pairs well with Death Touch, pairs well with a lot of things basically. And Warhorn Blast doesn't have the make you edict your 3-drop creature mode, which I use pretty often, right? Where I go like Raptor into 2, they play a good 3. I just go King Harold's Revenge, you take 4 damage and kill your creature, right? Which, and that's a very important part of the King Harold's Revenge. It's a very important mode of the card. And just in general, in my go wide decks, King Harold's Revenge is just a card I want 2 copies of a lot of the time. It is a very good card in those decks. This is another card that I think, going back to our original conversation about cards that people look at as like inherently less valuable than like a card draw spell or something. Like, you should look at this card and this type of card as like, where is this card good? Because when it's good, it's going to be very, very good. It's going to be as good as Behold the Multiverse is to the decks that want Behold the Multiverse, is the best way I can put it, right? It's all about what different decks want. It's not, card values are not absolute, right? It's, context is everything. I wouldn't play, I've been saying in the whole format, don't put not Glimpse the Cosmos, don't put Behold the Multiverse in your Battlefield Raptors decks, so. Yeah, good with Menace too, exactly. Tormentor's Helm, I talked about this one a little bit, but I think this is just like, kind of just the most generically good card. The most generically good enhancement, like, it's red, it's going to play well with the red cards. Plays well with flyers, plays well without flyers. I guess the thing I would say is that Tormentor's Helm is often better in your red decks than Pick. Like, I see Pick as a white card and Helm as a red card, generally, but Pick can also be a red card if you have evasion, like if you're a red-white deck, right? I think that's how I'm separating them often. So, like, if you're faced with that Pick in your base red deck, I will take Helm, generally. And the last thing I have here is just Raiders Carve, because Raiders Carve is often, like, one of the other most often questions I find is, what is this a carve deck, right? And a carve deck is generally a deck that just has 7 or 8 plus 3 power creatures, right? You want to be able to carve this with cheap creatures. I should qualify that, cheap creatures too. Cheap 3 power creatures, not like 6 drops, right? You want to crew this quickly. I often want this in decks where I have use for getting to 6 mana quickly. Like I have the sack lands, like the value lands. That's a good place for it. Thought Thief is something that Sam Black's does a lot. The Captain over here, where this crews this pretty well, because in your blue decks you often want to be ramping. You want to be getting more mana sources in play. Plays pretty well with Master Scald too. Just buying it back after it dies. And yeah, that's it.